Welcome back, class. If you're watching this, then I'm assuming you've watched the video called Charlie's Dilemma. If you'll recall from the video, at first Charlie seemed confident that he could make everything fit into his work week. Charlie began by stacking on task after task, and eventually his week was overflowing, and Charlie quickly felt overwhelmed. Simply put, Charlie allowed the little, insignificant things, the knickknacks in his life, occupy too much of his time. Seeing his frustration, Penelope suggested Charlie should focus on the major task first and fill in the rest of the gaps in his week with more trivial things. By the end of the video, and after following Penelope's advice, Charlie managed to fit everything into his week. Have you ever felt like Charlie? Have you ever started off a week or began a task confident that you could get it all done, only to eventually feel overwhelmed with too much to do? Sure, we all have. However, in our own lives, it's not always as simple as the video would suggest in regards to fitting it all into a week. In the video, each big rock demand was neatly labeled for Charlie. However, in our own lives, no one neatly labels the demands or the major issues that need our immediate attention. Therefore, we often struggle to figure out what to do next as we flutter from task to task. In other words, it may seem like everything is a major task that requires our time. Therefore, you may be thinking, how do I determine what's a big rock demand and what's a small rock demand as it relates to my actions? Simply put, we can separate big rock demands from small rock demands by classifying our actions into four categories or quadrants based on two factors: importance and urgency. So, when we look at our actions, we need to determine how important the task is in reaching our goals, and separate the action from the other, more trivial things vying for our time. Also, we need to consider any deadlines that are in place for us as we try to meet those goals. Although I'd love to offer you some magic potion that could easily define these for you, I cannot classify your actions. Only you can determine the importance of your actions, and only you can determine the urgency of your actions. However, if you've taken time to analyze each of your life roles and have defined your goals and dreams, then you should have a better picture of what's important in your life. Also, if you followed step 1 of the DAPS system, then you probably have established deadlines for your goals that defines a time frame for you to complete a particular task. So with that in mind, let's look at how each of our actions fall into the four quadrants so we can better determine what actions are those big rock demands and what actions are trivial to our success. In the first quadrant, actions are classified as being both important and urgent. Furthermore, these actions are usually done at the last minute under the pressure of looming deadlines. Usually, we wind up in this quadrant because we decided to do unimportant tasks first. In other words, we chose to procrastinate when we could have been doing other things. By focusing on the small, insignificant actions that occupy our time, we neglect the important things in our lives. Then we launch into a panic-induced mad dash to the finish to get the assignment or task done on time. Have you ever waited to write a paper until the night before it was due? Then you were operating in quadrant 1. In such a scenario, you realize that writing the paper was important to your success. However, since you delayed working on it until the last minute, the deadline creeped up on you and therefore created a sense of urgency to complete the paper at the last minute. We'll talk more about procrastination as this lesson progresses. However, just realize that when we procrastinate or choose to do unimportant tasks first, we are violating our own priorities. So, if we want to remain true to the goals and dreams we've established for ourselves, we should work to avoid procrastination whenever possible. Additionally, I've heard several students say, "I work better under pressure." But do you really? Also, Do you like the way you feel when you operate in such an environment? Working in Quadrant 1 puts a lot of stress on your body, but that's a topic we'll save for a future lesson. However, for now, please realize that if you choose to operate in Quadrant 1 too often, you're more susceptible to high blood pressure, higher levels of stress, and you may develop ulcers or be at a higher risk for a nervous breakdown. Therefore, it's in your best interest to avoid working in Quadrant 1 as much as possible. In Quadrant 2, our actions are defined as being important but not urgent, and those actions are done without the pressure of looming deadlines. Unlike the actions in Quadrant 1, Quadrant 2 activities release us from the pressure of looming deadlines. In Quadrant 2, you realize that a task is important and you develop a plan to work on the task a little at a time. Then, as the deadline approaches, you only need to complete a few last-minute tweaks to complete the task or assignment on time. Therefore, this is the quadrant in which your time is most productive and you're doing your best work to achieve your goals. In other words, you've acknowledged that a particular task is important, but you've allowed yourself enough time to complete the task to the best of your ability. Let's return to our previous example regarding the paper you needed to write for your class. If you operated in Quadrant 1, you stayed up all night writing the paper in a panic-induced deadline. However, if you had approached the paper like a creator, you would have operated in Quadrant 2. If you'll recall, creators take responsibility for their actions and complete purposeful actions that move them towards their goals and dreams. If you approach this assignment like a creator, you would have completed the assignment a little bit at a time. For example, the day you received the assignment, you may have brainstormed about possible topics to write about for the assignment. Then, a day or so later, you may have narrowed your topic and begin to think about the various points you wanted to make in the paper. A few days later, you may have begun research to look for references or materials to support the assumptions you made in the paper. A little later, you may have begun writing the paper or at least created a thorough outline. As the deadline approached, you would have felt pretty confident that you'd taken the necessary steps to complete the task on time. Furthermore, you'd probably had ample time to have your paper reviewed by a classmate or tutor and made edits to make your paper even better. Then, the night before the paper was due, all you would have had to have done is print out your paper or upload it to your instructor for a grade. In both quadrants 1 and 2, we acknowledge the paper was important to our success. However, which quadrant seemed less stressful? Which quadrant allowed us to do our best work? Simply put, by learning to work in Quadrant 2, you reduce your stress level by taking on major tasks a little at a time, and you're allowing yourself time to do your best work. So, if you're not already, begin thinking about ways to divide your major or big rock demands into smaller, more manageable bites. You'll do better work and you'll feel better also. Quadrant 3 differs from Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 greatly. Simply put, when we operate in Quadrant 3, we are completing actions that are not important but are urgent. In other words, when we operate in Quadrant 3, you're completing unimportant actions done with a sense of urgency, and that's often because you haven't learned to say no or let your phone go to voicemail. In Quadrants 1 and 2, our actions were classified as being important to us. However, in Quadrant 3, none of the actions we're completing are important to our goals and dreams. I often refer to this quadrant as the your mama's drama quadrant. Simply put, when we operate in Quadrant 3, we're allowing someone else to drag us off course. For example, let's say that you have a major assignment due tomorrow. However, a friend or family member calls you asking if you want to go out. This person says it's urgent and pulls you away from doing the activity important to your goals and dreams. Then you spend half the evening talking with him or her about nothing, and you do not complete your assignment. You've just operated in Quadrant 3. You've allowed someone else's urgency to talk you into an activity unimportant to your goals and dreams due to an inability to say no. You've acted as a victim because you've allowed someone else to hijack you away from your own goals and dreams. Now, before we move on from our discussion on Quadrant 3, I would like to clarify one point. I'm not saying that if someone asks for your help that you should not offer it. I'm a firm believer in taking care of my friends and family, and I would never say avoid your family for the sake of an assignment. However, what I am saying is that sometimes it's easy for those around us to drag us off course. So what I'm asking you to do is think consciously about the commitments you make to others and ask, is my help truly needed, or is this just another way I'm being dragged away from my goals and dreams? In other words, ask yourself if this task is truly important before you commit to it. Now, before we move on to our discussion of Quadrant 4 activities, I'd like for you to watch the next video entitled Tales of Mere Existence.